Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Depot Park in Clarkston, Michigan for our Elissa Slotkin for Congress event today. Thanks so much for joining us. Just a quick note about the program. We'll have a couple of speakers and then the Congresswoman will be available to take some questions. We'll take the first couple of questions from the audience here. We'll also try to take some questions from our audience that's watching the live stream online. So thanks again for joining us. And now I want to turn things over, ladies and gentlemen, to Jim McGrath.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Jim McGrath, and it's my great pleasure to speak to you today on why I support Elissa Slotkin for re-election to Congress. So a little bit of background on why this lifelong Republican is supporting a Democrat for Congress. I've lived in Clarkston for 27 years with my beautiful wife. We've raised two great kids, sent them to Clarkston schools, Notre Dame Prep, and Michigan State University, go green. And except for my 5 years on active duty in the U.S. Air Force, I've spent my entire life in Michigan. I love this state. My parents were born and raised here. All of my siblings live here. Our roots in Michigan go pretty deep. And that takes me to a little story I want to tell you on how I came to support Elissa. Back in 2012, I decided to pursue a dream I've always had, and that's to start a business. And so with a very good friend of mine, we started up a tech business here in Michigan. It's called 7 Points Consulting. It's based in Bloomfield Hills, and we help companies with cloud computing needs. And we talked about where to put the business. We were thinking about moving it to different places, but we chose Michigan for a couple of key reasons. Number one, the tech talent in this area is great. We're very close to some excellent schools, Michigan State, Michigan, Wayne State, Oakland. We've got great tech talent here. And also the cost of living here compared to California, the East Coast, where there are other tech hubs, we have a great competitive edge here. So we were very excited to start our business here in Michigan. But this is where I had a rude awakening. Because when we started our business, my partner and I decided that for the first 18 months, we were on our own for healthcare. So I naively just went out and filled out some forms to get some insurance quotes. And lo and behold, I didn't get quotes, I got rejections. And the reason I got rejected is because my wife had had a surgery a few years prior, a minor surgery, and we were deemed to have had a pre-existing condition. And while I eventually did get insurance, that was very traumatic for me. We went many weeks with no insurance. And if you're raising kids and you've got needs, right, not having insurance was an eye-opener. So that's how I came to meet Elissa. I heard her story about her struggles with healthcare and how she had to deal with issues in trying to treat her mom. And I found that very compelling. And so I'm supporting Elissa because she supports affordable healthcare and access to that healthcare for all of us. She's also been a real champion on trying to get the cost of drugs down. My 90-year-old father is a diabetic. He takes Landis twice a day. That drug has gone up huge in the last several years. So trying to get those costs down is very important to me personally. The other thing that I really admire about Elissa is her accessibility. Prior to Elissa, we did not have a representative who held town halls. Messages and phone calls went unanswered. Not with Elissa. I've been to some of her town halls, and I don't know if anybody here been to one of the town halls? Yeah, they get a little rowdy, right? They're a little energetic. And you know, she does not shy away from tough questions, and I think that says a lot, right? It's not, you know, taking all the easy stuff, right? She takes the hard questions too. The other thing that I love about Elissa is that she, in my opinion, embodies Michigan values. My business supports companies all over the country. I've traveled, not this year, of course, but in many years past, and I've been to New York, I've been to California, I've been all over the country doing business. And there's something about Midwestern values that I very much appreciate. And I think Elissa embodies that willingness to be pragmatic, to get things done, to work bipartisan, to make sure that the right things are going to get done for the benefit of all of us. And lastly, and this is a part that's really near and dear to my heart, is Elissa is data-driven. She looks at the numbers, she looks at the facts, and I think her years in service to the country as a CIA analyst really comes through. And as she's looking at problems to solve, she's looking at the data, and she is going to go where the data says we should go. And I think in Washington today, that's sorely missing. We need representatives who are going to follow the facts and take the solution to where the facts say we need to go. So it is with my great pleasure, and I ask all of you to join me in welcoming our Congresswoman, Elissa Slotkin.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see you. I am a complete and utter extrovert, and so just seeing other people makes me happy. Thank you for coming out in a socially distanced way. Thank you to the many, many of you who are watching from online. This is our attempt to reimagine and recast a campaign for the era of COVID. We're going to try it. It's something new. So thank you for being part of this experiment. It is definitely experiment. You know, we have this great system where every 2 years the House of Representatives has an election. And that is to keep people accountable for their actions. And I'm a big believer in accountability. And so every 2 years, I will have to prove my muster and stand in front of this district and ask for people's vote. And so what we are trying to do is do what we did last cycle, go to people on a personal basis, try and connect with them, even with COVID, and ask that they consider us this election cycle in November. Obviously, the agenda items are really the crocodile closest to the boat, which is COVID, the public health issues, and the economic issues. And we have been working very, very hard to try and figure out how we're going to get through this as a state and as a country. To be honest, back in March and April, when COVID was really hitting Michigan hard, I wasn't focused on the campaign. I was focused on the issue that people were calling us about, literally the phones ringing off the hook, which was the issue of personal protective equipment for our frontline workers, for our nurses, our doctors, our first responders, our firefighters. I just came from the Rochester Fire Hall, and hearing their stories about getting PPE in the middle of this crisis was harrowing. And we, frankly, did something I never thought I'd do in my life. We basically became dealers on personal protective equipment and finding people where we could buy personal protective equipment. And that, I'm sure you all heard the harrowing stories from our doctors and our nurses of people sharing masks, sharing gowns, not being able to get swabs, not being able to get reagent. We spent March and April on the phone, usually with Chinese middlemen in the middle of the night who were waiting in line at a factory in rural China to try and get some orders in for our hospitals and for our state. I will tell you that that is not a normal job for a congressperson. I have a national security background. You all know that. I'm a former CIA officer and Pentagon official. I did 3 tours in Iraq alongside the military. I met my husband in Iraq. We had a classic Baghdad romance. We met in Saddam's palace. And I have 2 stepdaughters, both in service. One is a brand new Army officer, and the other one is a physician at the VA who is now, she's in Texas, working largely on COVID patients. So we're a service family. And to be honest with you, I was never into politics, because when you're a CIA officer married to an Army colonel, you really take your oath of office seriously. You are not political. You work for whoever is your commander in chief. And I did that very proudly for almost 15 years. I ended up working for a time in the Bush White House, briefed him every morning, sent him a memo every night. And I was there the Friday that he left office, and there the Tuesday that Barack Obama was sworn in. Did the same job for a very different president. And to be honest with you, I would go and brief Congress as part of my role as a CIA officer and later as a Pentagon official, and it was never a club I wanted to be a part of. But the tone and tenor of what went on in 2016, the campaign in 2016, really just changed my thought on what we wanted out of our system, what we expected of people in leadership, especially in elected leadership. So I started thinking about running. But as Jim said, when you've never been a candidate, you've never kind of come up in the system, you don't really know how to do it. I had a lot of coffees with people to try and learn. And I was reticent to get in. But what pushed me over the edge was most definitely healthcare. And it's personal. Like so many things in life, we do things that we're personally connected to. And for me, that was my mom and her experience not being able to afford healthcare basically for much of her adult life because she had a pre-existing condition. She had breast cancer when I was a little girl, when I was about 4 years old. She was 31 and she survived, but for the rest of her life, she had a pre-existing condition. And it's hard to sometimes remember now, but until the ACA, it was completely normal to gouge people who happened to have a pre-existing condition when they went to go and try and secure healthcare, health insurance. My parents divorced in 1986, and my mom lost her job in 2002. And when she lost her job, she lost her insurance. And because of that pre-existing condition, when she, like Jim, went to go shopping for health insurance, she could not afford what was on offer to her. My brother and I were kind of finishing high school, into college. We did not know what her healthcare status was, but she went for 5.5 years with no insurance. So no checkup, no gynecological exam, no one saying, you had breast cancer so young, you should probably get a hysterectomy or some genetic testing. In 2008, my brother and I helped her get insurance here in suburban Detroit. It was $1,000 a month and a $10,000 deductible. So her highest bill, higher than a rent. And in the summer of 2009, without us knowing, she let it lapse. And in September of 2009, she walked into Henry Ford to the emergency room and was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. Now, I'm sure many of you know what it's like to be in receipt of that phone call when you find out a loved one has a terminal diagnosis. I was in my early 30s. I was a CIA officer, and my life, as I knew it, exploded. And that same week and that same month that our lives were exploding were the same week and the same month that we were filling out the paperwork for her to declare bankruptcy. So the issue of covering people with pre-existing conditions is deeply, deeply personal. And it's still the issue I hear, frankly, most about when I'm at the grocery store or I'm out getting soft serve. People talk to me about the price of healthcare, the price of prescription drugs, especially things like insulin, very common drugs. Clean water, making sure that as the Great Lakes state, we have clean water both to swim in and fish in, but also to drink. And then frankly, what Jim was talking about, this idea that our elected leaders should be civil and decent. That even if we disagree, and Lord knows, my dad was a lifelong Republican, my mom was a lifelong Democrat, my in-laws are devoted Trump voters. That even if we disagree, it doesn't mean we have to be vitriolic, that we have to have a zero-sum situation. And I believe in bipartisanship in my very core. It's how I was trained. Because if you're over in Iraq, you know, working alongside the military, going out with them into Baghdad, no one ever asks before you start that mission, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? No one cares. No one cares because it's about the mission of doing things that protect people's lives. And that is what I see as my job as your representative. It is my mission and my responsibility to work across the aisle, especially now with divided government, to find those areas where we agree and get something done that improves people's pocketbooks, that improves the lives of their kids. So I'm extremely proud that we were able to pass 9 provisions into law in the past 18 months. 6 of those 9 are on PFAS and raising the standards on the issue of PFAS, since we know Michigan, unfortunately, is kind of leading the way on dealing with this issue. We've passed or pushed another 22 bills in the House of Representatives, all of them bipartisan. And people sometimes ask me, I get questions from people, frankly, a lot of Democrats who say, how can you work with Republicans? I'm just coming back from a day of working with Republican mayors in town after town after town, trying to deal with getting people what they need so their businesses stay afloat, so that they have the equipment they need to deal with people safely in their dental office. That is my job. And I hope the value proposition that I bring for your review is that my commitment to that, my mission focus, I hope, is worth consideration of your vote. Now, we just had a primary on the Republican side. There was a primary, and we now know who we're running against. We have 85 days until the election. And something that's very important to me is to do what our founding fathers intended and have public forums, debates where we can talk about the policy differences between myself and my opponent. So on primary night, I challenged my opponent to 3 debates in our 3 counties, Oakland County, Livingston County, and Ingham County. We want them broadcast as widely as possible for the COVID era so that people have a real choice. And what I'd ask is that people look at the record, at the way that I've tried to go about the job. There is no way in a district like the 8th District of Michigan, which is a deeply independently minded district, that everyone's going to agree with everything I have done in my first 18 years. Lord, my husband doesn't agree with everything that I've done in my first 18 months, excuse me. And that's okay. I'd ask you to consider that while you may not agree with every single thing that I have done, I hope you believe me when I tell you I did it based on data, based on listening, based on my oath of office and my integrity. That is how I've tried to appeal to a district that has very disparate views and very different ideas about what they want out of their elected representative. So I thank you for coming. It's going to be a sprint these last 85 days. We all know election season gets a little wonky, and we're all usually happy when it's done. But I wanted to come out to Clarkston for folks in this area, which has been such a wonderful area to work with. I've worked extremely closely with the mayor here, Eric Haven, on this congested main road where people sometimes go a little too fast. We've worked on a bunch of projects together, and it's been my honor to represent this district, and I hope I'm given the opportunity to continue. So thank you for coming, and I'm more than happy to take your questions. Thank you. All right. Who will be, the COVID era, one of the things that's a hallmark of the COVID era is it's quiet. It's very quiet, So who will be a brave soul and ask a question? And you can ask whatever you'd like. Sir.
Yeah, I was just wondering if this Trump White House filed some sort of brief or petition with the Supreme Court to rule the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional. And if so, that would make protection for pre-existing conditions go away. I wondered, did that really happen, or did I dream it, or was it a nightmare?
Yeah.
And if so, what is the status of that, and what do you think the prospects are for that sort of effort?
Sure. So I'm going to repeat the question for the folks watching on the live stream. So the question was about the ACA. And a question on the status of the lawsuit. It's actually called Texas versus California, I believe. And which was put forward by the White House to invalidate the Affordable Care Act. And let me just start by saying, in my 19 months now of being the representative here, we have been playing constant defense on an unending attack on those protections for people with pre-existing conditions. And the story I just told you about my mom, I actually got to tell in the House of Representatives, on the floor of the House, in front of 434 of my peers, because there was yet another legislative attempt to undermine those protections. We pushed it back, but it's kind of unending. The other one that came up, and it didn't get a ton of visibility, but we actually had doctors and nurses from around this area come to DC to talk about what they were seeing in the hospitals and doctors' offices, these junk plans. And these are plans that were originally intended to just be 3 months, kind of a bridge to another plan. And the White House signed an executive order saying that those plans could be 3 years. Those plans don't cover basic things like prenatal care, delivery, baby delivery, basic things that they just don't protect people with pre-existing conditions and consider being a woman a pre-existing condition. So we've been fighting to push back on that. And then this court case, which has largely been bubbling for the entire 18 months that I've been in Congress. In June, the president reinforced this court case by filing another brief explaining why the underlying principles should be overturned. So no protections for people with pre-existing conditions, no lifetime cap on total costs on how much you spend, let's say if you've got a rare disease, and no allowing your children to stay on your health care for until they're 26. They just filed that brief in the middle of everything that's gone on with COVID, you know, and the Supreme Court could rule on that case as early as October. So we are on pins and needles because quite literally, if the Supreme Court sides with the White House, 22 million people will automatically lose their insurance in the country, and hundreds of thousands here in Michigan. So that is a very big deal. It doesn't get a ton of press because we're all living in the 24-hour news cycle. But for me and for many of us who depend on those principles of protecting people, it is the big kind of date we're looking at is October or potentially soon after. Thanks for asking. Yes, sir.
Yes, where do we stand on the HEROES Act that you guys passed with the negotiations with the White House?
So the HEROES Act, passed the House at the end of May. It was a negotiating position. There were things that were good about it, including making sure that our states have some money for things like our fire, police, first responders, or teachers. I want to make sure people are tracking that if we don't come to some negotiated deal between the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, we are facing a pretty stark challenge in September and a potential layoff situation that none of us wants to see of the very people who've been on the front lines. It also passed some important provisions that I supported on bringing manufacturing back to the United States, particularly of medical supplies and pharmaceuticals, because we got caught with our pants down during COVID-19. I mean, if we are bargaining for a 78-cent mask with a Chinese middleman in the middle of the night, something has gone terribly wrong, and we've just outsourced our manufacturing to China way beyond what's acceptable. And there's national security implications of outsourcing to China like that. The negotiations with the Senate and the White House began in July. And as you've likely heard, after 2 weeks of negotiating, they hit an impasse. The president went ahead and put forward a series of executive orders this past weekend. I think the most effective one is probably extending a moratorium on students having to pay back their federal loans. The other executive orders don't have a ton of teeth because the US Constitution gives the right to appropriate funds to the US Congress. And so the president can move some money around, but he can't allocate and appropriate new money. So we still need everyone to come back to the table. I urge my colleagues on all sides of the aisle to just put down the partisanship and get back in the room to negotiate. What else? We have a question, I think, from the live stream. Yes, go ahead.
The person on the live stream says they're concerned about the post office.
Yes.
Mail-in ballots. So could you address that?
Sure. The question from the live stream was, what is the status of the post office and delays and problems that we've been hearing about with the post office? So I think folks, just raise your hand if you've noticed any kind of delay at all in your delivery. Yeah, I think most of us have been seeing some delays. Maybe it's taking a few days longer. I know my brother mailed a card to my dad from St. Louis to Michigan, and it took 10 days to arrive. The place where we're really seeing the delays are the packages. Packages seem to be in a sort of a category on their own and are really being stretched out. So that's a problem in the near term for anyone who gets really important things sent in the mail, like their pharmaceuticals. A ton of us, especially Michiganders, have mail order prescription drugs, things like insulin that come in the mail on a regular basis. And we've been seeing weeks long, sometimes 2-week delays on some of our packages. So the Postmaster General, the man who's in charge of the post office, made the decision that he was going to end overtime for postal employees. And it turned out the post office employees were doing a lot of overtime. So the delays that you're seeing right now are because they're not being paid beyond their standard hours. There is no option for working overtime. Obviously, this was a cost-cutting measure. And I think the thing that I'm concerned about is it just doesn't recognize how much particularly small communities depend on the post office. Particularly our older citizens really need our post office to deliver things on time. I was hoping that in a negotiated deal between the House, Senate, and the White House on this new COVID appropriation, there would be a deal on the post office. I still hope there will be, and that's another reason I want them back at the table. But this does obviously have implications for our election in November. We all know that we're now allowed in Michigan to have no reason absentee. We had huge numbers in the primary last Tuesday who voted absentee. And the Secretary of State is expecting 3 million Michiganders to vote absentee in November, which is way beyond our historic highs. And due to the delays, people are concerned about sticking that absentee ballot in the mail, right? And we don't want to have anyone have to choose between their vote, their democratic right to vote, and their health, especially our most vulnerable. This is extremely important that we get this worked out. In the meantime, unless and until there's a deal, I just recommend that no one put their ballot in the mail after October 20th. I've just come to that point. There are boxes that our clerks have in their offices, and on election day, there are these boxes that are put out. You can almost drive right up to them and put your absentee ballot in there without going inside a polling location. It's not ideal, but it is my best recommendation, given that we have a real sort of strategic problem with the post office right now.
And we had another person on the live stream who asked about Social Security benefits and concern about the rising cost of living and also about the sort of stability of Social Security right now.
Yeah, the question was on the stability of Social Security. What is the status, and with rising costs of living, what's happening with threats to Social Security? So if you work your entire life and you pay into Social Security, you pay into Medicare, you should be able to use and enjoy those benefits when you come of age. That should not be a question 70 years after we've installed these programs, especially since you pay in. There is always a conversation about Social Security and whether it should be cut, the age should change, it should be made older when you start receiving Medicare or Social Security. This is kind of a perennial conversation. I am a big belief that those programs, people work their entire lives for them, and they should be there when they expected them to be there. This past weekend, the president, one of his executive orders called for a hold on the payroll tax. If you have a job, you probably pay a payroll tax. And what I think is important to note is that that payroll tax pays into Social Security and Medicare. It does. So we can hold it and either ask people to pay it later, which is a big old bill they're going to have to pay later, or we're not going to ask them to pay it back, and we're going to lose that source of revenue for Social Security right when we need it the most. So I can't, in good faith, support the president's decision on a payroll tax because I need that money going into Social Security. Where I would rather focus the effort is on getting people back to work who don't have a job, who aren't employed right now. Since we have in our state 21% unemployment. And like I said, the air in the room is just going to start to feel different come September, particularly if we're laying off civil servants, teachers, fire, and police. Anyone else from the audience here? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Sure. So the question was on the Russian bounties. The story that leaked in July, I believe, that alleged that the Russians were paying the Taliban to attack and kill American soldiers, American military in Afghanistan. And so just to review the bidding, that story comes out. And a number of us with an intelligence background and a military background were invited by the White House to come to the Situation Room, to come to the White House, the West Wing, and get a briefing on that intelligence. And I attended that. There was about 8 or 10 of us. I want to be honest that there are questions about the veracity of that intelligence, right? Like, it's not a surefire thing that we know without a doubt that Russia did this. And in fact, there's a real debate within the intelligence community. Some say it's serious and some say we're not so sure. And that's legit. And since that briefing, I've had multiple other classified briefings on this very issue. So that's definitely true. I think the thing that was hard for me, and then the congressman, I said, you know, I understand. I'm from the intelligence community. When you're not sure about intel, you can't be making radical policy changes based on something you're not sure of. But the thing that was hard to understand is I used to work at the White House. And if something like this came in, you get this report, and it would be such an escalation if the Russians were putting bounties on US soldiers' heads. And my stepdaughter could easily be deployed to Afghanistan in the next 18 months. Wouldn't you want to just alert the president that, Mr. President, these pieces of intelligence have come in, we're running it down, we're going to find out whether it's true or not. In the meantime, we want you to be aware. And that's especially true because the president between March 30th and June 3rd spoke 5 times to Vladimir Putin. They were speaking every other week. So as a former staffer on the White House staff for 2 presidents, I just wanted to check myself. And I called the former Republican National Security Advisor under George Bush, a man named Steve Hadley. He was my boss. And I said, hey, boss, what would we have done if this intelligence came in? And he said, we would have slapped a cover note on it. We would have said, Mr. President, we don't know if it's real or not. We're going to run it down. But in the meantime, as you're speaking with Putin, you may want to hold on bringing that relationship closer. You may want to hold on inviting him into the G8, you know, back into the club of kind of top economic nations. You may want to just pause until we can run this down. And that's what I couldn't understand, and that they didn't even think to show it to him or to tell him in any way this was out there. And I didn't understand why. And I still don't. So the good news is I'm on the Armed Services Committee. So we had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense come in front of our committee in July. And I feel confident that they are doing everything they can on force protection to protect your family members, my family members, and everyone's family members who are out there. Afghanistan has never been a safe place. So they are taking extreme precautions as they do. And I do not believe that our soldiers on the ground are at any greater risk than they are just generally being deployed to Afghanistan. So I feel good about that kind of back end. But as for the policy issues and as for this cozying up to Putin, it is hard for me. It is hard for me as a Cold War kid, right? As someone who grew up thinking Soviet Union, like that's our big enemy. But then as a national security professional who had to negotiate with the Russians on Syria, who had to engage and watch what they did in places like the Arctic and Eastern Europe, they're not our friends. They're not our friends. So I think folks are doing their utmost to keep people safe in Afghanistan, but I can't explain that gap that happened in the White House staffing. Yeah. Yes, ma'am, in the back. Yes. Yeah. So the question was on this lady, it works in manufacturing, and was talking about getting people back to work and how difficult it's been for many employers, frankly, across this district, across the state, in getting folks to come back to work, particularly, I've heard this from many business owners, out of concern that the extra $600 per unemployment check was maybe disincentivizing people from coming back to work. I've heard this from many employers. So a couple of things. I think there are actually a lot of reasons why people are not looking for work in the numbers that we would expect. Certainly, having more amounts of money in their paycheck is a big one. But we just got a childcare problem. I mean, there are legitimately people, I mean, if you've got a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, you can't go looking for work as much as you'd like to. Who's going to take care of the kids, right? And then you have people who, for health reasons or the health reasons of their family, are just saying, I want to work, but the trade-off is really high. You know, I take care of my mom, and my mom is 80, and she's got health issues. And so the sort of like cost-benefit analysis that people are doing is different than it was 6 months ago if they didn't have a job. But there's no getting around it. That extra $600 plays into the calculus. The negotiations that were going on in Washington were debating $400 per check. Frankly, I think where we were likely to end up and where we will still likely end up is somewhere between 0 and 400, right? So there'll be more, but maybe not as much more. Frankly, in addition to the incentive issues, there's also like the fiscal responsibility issues, right? Just there's got to be some fiscal theory behind these large trillion-dollar bills. And I actually do care deeply about the debt, right? And we just can't keep doing these bills. That said, I think we need something because we want them to be spending that money, right? We want them out in our economy, but we also want them looking for work. My sense was always that those negotiations would end up between kind of $0 and $400 more per check, which I think was particularly given that Michigan's minimum wage was a lot lower than it is in other parts of the country, would probably balance out to be about right. What else? Anyone else in the audience here? Yes, ma'am. Yes. Sure. So the question was on what are we doing to protect ourselves from foreign interference in our elections? So again, as a national security person, and as someone who's on the Homeland Security Committee, we oversee election security. And the Department of Homeland Security has a whole unit. This is what they do, is focus on hardening the elections and make sure that the administration of our elections is safe. So I think there's a couple different issues. One, there's kind of foreign mucking around in our political process. Remember these like fake Facebook ads and kind of bots that were spreading information? That's a classic Russian play that we saw in 2016. They do it, frankly, much better in Eastern Europe, where they try to get the citizens to turn against each other so they're not focusing on Russia, right? It's actually like an old school play of theirs from the Soviet Union days. They were kind of ham-handed about it in 2016. You know, they had these sort of like fake groups and they had these fake protests and they advertised all this stuff. But Michigan was a real target of those ads because we're a swing state. They have gotten better at that. And then other actors have gotten into the mix, right? The Chinese, the Iranians, to a lesser extent, the North Koreans. They're all interested in kind of playing in that political process. Some of them would like to see President Trump win. Some of them would like to see a President Biden win. The thing that gets me is that we've actually not passed one law since 2016 to make us safer from that foreign mucking around. And that drives me bonkers because no matter what party you're from, who wants a foreigner playing in an American election? Nobody that I know. So they've gotten a bit more sophisticated. The Russians in particular have sort of figured out, well, we did something last time, now let's try something new. But that we aren't particularly safe from that, and that's why it's extremely important we question the origin of everything that comes across our screens. I mean, the news agency Russia Today, RT, is clearly boosting little stories into our Facebook feeds because I got them in Holly. So they're out there, right? Especially, frankly, with the whole George Floyd protests, like you could see a real spike in them trying to like get us to be against each other. So that's foreign influence in our political process. Then there's just the safety of our elections, right? Like, can they hack in to the ballot counting? Can they get into the system and change the results or do something, you know, break our elections equipment? Can they do something really horrible? And on that score, I actually feel better, because one of the things we have done in Congress, passed through the Senate and signed by the president, is an extra $400 million in election security dollars. And so our state, along with every other state, got money to protect the actual equipment from hacking, from cyber attack, which is good. Still have to be vigilant, but it's good. And then I'll be honest, something I'm concerned about now is what I call kind of polls closing and on. I'm worried that we may not know the results of the election for a few days because of all the absentee ballots. We did a good job in Michigan, but New York State took 2 months to count their absentee ballots, 2 months from their primary. So, you know, what if we have a situation where we don't know who the president is? We like to know and have clear assurances that we know who the winner was, and we're going to transition in January. And so that gives me some stress, I'll be honest. And we just had a contested election in the US. It was Bush v. Gore. Anyone remember like the hanging chads, right? We just had this. But I'm not sure we're as healthy as a country as we were during that time. And so that is sort of raising my anxiety level, I will say. So physical security, I feel best about, which is good. But I also don't appreciate, I'll be frank, trying to discredit the results and the form of the election ahead of it. I don't like that. This is our democracy. No matter what party you come from, you should care about executing our elections on time, safely, and responsibly. They held an election in the middle of the Civil War where they could hear guns firing from the battlefield. We can hold an election during COVID if we're responsible about it. All right, anyone else? Then maybe we'll take, oh, yes, ma'am, sorry. Sure. The question for those watching at home was, what is my stance or what's my approach on defunding the police, on transitioning some of those resources to mental health professionals, and probably the whole basket of issues that have come up since George Floyd was killed. So obviously, I don't know anyone who watched the video of George Floyd being killed and felt anything other than despair, frankly. And obviously, everyone has the right to protest peacefully and responsibly. I will tell you, I do not believe in defunding the police. We have to be a nation of rules and laws from the very top to the very bottom. And especially since what we want is more training, more awareness by our police. That takes money. You can't take away resources and then expect them to all do the kind of training that we want folks to have. The good news is that in the state of Michigan, a lot of the training that we've been talking about at the federal level has been going on. A lot of the practices like chokeholds have not been used for many, many years, have not been taught for many, many years. But I just can't, in good conscience, support defunding the police. And I think we have to be practical. I am all for mental health professionals doing more to help on those issues that are nonviolent mental health issues that the police are being called in to handle. And let's be clear, they've been given that mission because we have a major mental health crisis going on in our country, right? So the police and sometimes our fire they're at the 911 call that are basically the service of last resort to help these people. But I also want to be honest that we can't just wish away that some of those folks be nonviolent when they have an episode. And I don't know, I have friends who are social workers, and they're often going in with the police when someone's having a psychic break, when someone's having some sort of breakdown or problem. And while, of course, our goal is that that situation be nonviolent, my 5'3" social worker friends need to know that they have support if they need it for someone who might get violent because they're having a mental break. So I can't support defunding the police. I don't. But what I am willing to do is have a real conversation about the use of resources in dealing with the actual problems that are on the ground. And what we have definitely done is deeply underfunded mental health services across the board, everything from addiction to folks with special needs, the whole range of needs was at a crisis level before COVID. I will just say, I just came from Rochester from the fire department there. And I said, what have you seen that's changed? And suicides and suicide attempts, mental health issues in general, they are answering way more calls. And so this problem is getting worse, it's not getting better, and deserves an honest to God, serious conversation. Okay, any last question? And then we'll let y'all get on with what's turning out to be a beautiful evening. Yes, sir. Yes, I just saw in the car on the way over here that Vice President Biden has selected Kamala Harris as his vice presidential candidate. I feel like the big reveal, it was just, we were building and it was built up. I think it's a positive thing. I think it's a positive thing because Senator Harris has worked at the federal level. She's been a prosecutor. She's been someone involved in elected politics, but also in leadership roles for a long time now. I think that, all of us should care about who the vice president would be because they're a heartbeat away, as everyone is, when they're vice president to being the president. Most recently, she and I co-sponsored a bill on the Russia issue, actually, and just requesting that every single year, the Pentagon and the intelligence community produce a report that just lays out in unclassified form the Russian threats to US forces, right? Just let's be honest about it. So we've gotten a chance to work together in recent weeks. So I think it's a positive thing. For me, what I'm hoping is we get through the next 85 days, remembering who we are as a country, remembering to treat each other decently, and remembering that our kids are watching us. And they're looking at how to act when they watch leaders on TV. I try to go in with that spirit, but I hope our senior-most leaders do the same thing. Okay? Thank you, everyone, for coming out. It was lovely of you. Thank you for everyone watching on live stream. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for caring about your country and your community. Thanks so much.